Welcome to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset, the leading data and analytics company for the cannabis industry.
Welcome back to the High Rise, a laid-back, data-backed conversation, all things cannabis, where we cover U.S. MSOs, Canadian LPs, products and market analysis through the lens of data. Today, I'm joined by Emily Paxia.
Hi, everyone.
Maggie Connors.
Hi, great to be here.
And Will Yakowitz.
Hey, guys.
All right. Well, it's my favorite time of the week here, talking about all the wild cannabis news. I feel like every week there's just more and more coming at us. So let's start today with the big news that landed yesterday. And Will, you covered this pretty extensively in a piece over at Forbes. It looks like Amazon now supports federal cannabis legalization. Will, you want to kind of give us a little background on what this might mean?
Yeah, I think, the announcement yesterday, Amazon said that it has changed its drug testing policies for the majority of its employees. So now it'll no longer disqualify employees for testing positive or potential employees testing positive for marijuana. So the interesting thing here is, and this doesn't include anybody that's managed under the DOT, so drivers, people who operate machinery, and to be clear, if there's any accidents or anything, drug testing will take place. And I guess that really the through line, the way to think about it, is marijuana will be treated the same way as alcohol. So just the same way you can't show up drunk at work, you're not going to be able to show up high at work either. And then the other big thing was that Amazon said its public policy team, they have a formidable public policy team, and they lobby for, really so many issues because the company is so big and they touch, so many parts of the economy, and that they're now going to be actively supporting the MORE Act. And, as we know, the MORE Act, it was reintroduced by Nadler in the House last week, and it's to legalize cannabis by descheduling it. So that it's a huge thing. I mean, it really can't be understated. It can't really can't be overstated how huge this development is. Obviously, everybody knows, Amazon's one of the biggest companies and employers in the world. So, I'm kind of thinking of it in two ways. Like, there's an economic incentive. Now, if we're looking at federal legalization, it's no longer politicians being like, hey guys, we really need to do this. It's no longer cannabis companies that like, hey guys, we need to do this. That doesn't move anybody. People who are selling cannabis, trying to get cannabis legalized, that's not going to convince anybody who's unconvinced, right? But a company like Amazon, it's just like kind of putting their flag, their stake in the ground, saying we support this. At this point, it's ridiculous that it's illegal. I think it's going to be huge, just a really big change in the culture, how people think about it. So that's kind of my take on it. And then the employment thing too. Kind of my skepticism is like, this is also, they're probably having a hard time finding employees. So, anecdotally, a bunch of people on Twitter are like, I wish this news happened last year. I got, applied for a job, passed everything except the drug test, and it was for marijuana. But, so to me, I kind of see like the labor crunch as companies, specifically Amazon, growing really fast, trying just to, we saw this in the federal government too. I think the FBI recently said, like, okay, if you've smoked weed in your life, like, you should still apply. So I think it's kind of that aspect too. While it's very cool, I think it's also an economic decision,
Yeah, and I don't really care what drives the decision anymore, because I'm so sick of everything being so upside down and inside out about cannabis policy that I'm like, if it takes needing to hire people and eliminating the friction points to that, I'm like, I'll take that as a W. And the other thing that I'm happy about with it, which I think you pointed out so tactfully is that it's being treated like alcohol. And one of the things that has driven me absolutely crazy is the way that we discuss impairment as a society, and where cannabis is demonized, but alcohol is acceptable, pills are acceptable. And to me, when I see people who are taking certain types of pill medication, it may be prescribed and completely legal, but it could completely impair them if they're not using it the way that it's meant to be used. And to me, that's, as a person on the road, as a person in the world, I feel much more concerned about impairment as an issue, not cannabis. And I think that we need to back up and have a conversation about this. And this is one of the reasons that for a long time I've been very opposed to these breathalyzers around cannabis, because I think it actually could be just used to weaponize in the war on drugs and disproportionately impact communities of color again. But rather, I'd like to have a bigger conversation about impairment as a society and think about how it relates to safety. So I'm very happy to see that Amazon took this stance, and I'm happy if it means more people can get jobs in these facilities, whether or not they're, I mean, I think we could debate how great it is to work at Amazon, but I think people would take being employed and having the option to make that choice in their lives versus not having it as something available. And then I just think it's really interesting that they leaned in on the MORE Act, which, we were talking about in the pre-show a little bit, that it's one of the more progressive bills going forward, and it has a more inclusion on equity pieces. And I do wonder, Amazon has been a little bit under scrutiny for some of what it's like to work at Amazon and the practices there. And so I wonder if they tried to lean in on a more progressive bill to kind of work towards repairing some of their reputation, but in this new context. So, I just can't help but think about that. And then I just tried out a joke on Twitter, which was, and it seems like it's getting some good responses, which is, you're gonna, if your pitch is that you're the Amazon of cannabis, you're gonna have to work on refining that pitch at this point.
Yeah.
So
I also think it's a huge step in just our everyday fight to help destigmatize cannabis, which is one of the biggest employers saying, actually, it's okay. Actually, it's akin to alcohol, which a different conversation. But, every day up against this for them to not only be changing policies, but also internally, but also supporting public policy is a huge, frankly, unexpected ally from my perspective. But, it's happening. Amazon's in.
It's definitely happening. I'm here in Seattle, and Amazon, Microsoft. Like when we talk about post-pandemic and going back to the office, so much of this city is driven by their decisions. So when they say, okay, at the end of June, we're going to bring everyone back in, or we're going to open our office, that kind of becomes the line in the sand for other companies to say, okay, well, Amazon's leading the charge because they have such a massive footprint here. And I think in a lot of ways, this could be that for business in general, right? Now, they've said this. Now, other businesses can be more confident to come out and say that this as well. And they don't have to be the first one. They don't have to, make waves in the headlines, for better or for worse, depending on what they do. So hopefully this does kind of open the floodgates for other businesses, because I would imagine Amazon is a massive footprint, the type of employee that they're looking for around this. There's a lot of similar companies out there that probably need to do the same thing. So, I'm pretty happy with the headline, and it's kind of like what Emily, you're saying. It's like anything that will keep pushing this forward, I think is just good momentum. And it's pretty exciting that they didn't just change their policy. Like they could have quietly changed their policy, like the FBI example, they could have said, it's fine, we're not going to test for this anymore in the markets maybe where it's legal. But the fact that they actually are backing the MORE Act and being vocal about we need to get this descheduled in a bigger way at a national level is pretty big deal. So now hopefully those that do follow say, well, it's not just enough to say we're going to change our policy, but we're actually going to try and change public policy at the same time.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point.
I was just remembering in light of Biden, some staffers coming in earlier this year and then having to leave, admitting to having consumed cannabis, which felt like a step backwards. Amazon coming in, again, huge ally, and hopefully a significant step change.
Yeah, and I think, Maggie, what you said before, like, I think really the power of the, like, destigmatizing cannabis, marijuana use as an employer, I think that's going to be really powerful. And then, Sai, looking to what you said, Amazon has a huge public policy arm that does, many things besides lobbying. But, I mean, the force, I think, behind it is going to be really strong. I think it's when you see people like Charles Koch, when you see companies like Amazon coming to the table to try to influence and change politicians' minds, it's I think it's just a whole nother world. And frankly, I think it's easier to change minds when you're those people and those companies than somebody in the industry. And frankly, I think there's really no other way. I think the kind of the goodwill, this is medicine, like all of those perspectives have really done all the work they can to this point, and now it really is down to, like, okay, cool, who's not involved in the industry? And Amazon may have ulterior motives, like they're the everything store, who knows. They obviously know all about delivery and logistics, and this industry is going to need a lot of delivery and logistics if we're talking interstate commerce. But who knows? That's pure speculation. But it could just be, they have this huge public policy arm that's doing tons of work in Washington, and like this is a good cause for them to take up. Either for business reasons, political, cultural, reputational, like whatever it is. But yeah, it's fascinating to me, I think.
Yeah. And Will, you make an excellent point. One of my great policy mentors when I first got into this industry was like, the more unlikely the bedfellows, the better, because they just break through where we've all been kind of shouting and they're kind of like, yeah, we've heard you. But, it's nice to get some people who have a different walk of life to be on the same side. And you're absolutely right. I'm sure. I mean, look, it's a business motive, I'm sure, 100% in the end of the day. And I can't help but think about the first thing I thought was get ready for that interstate commerce push.
Yeah.
But maybe they start with CBD. Sorry, what was that?
Definitely CBD. I've always wondered how long till we're buying weed in Whole Foods. And this is quite a big step towards that.
Good point.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of sounds like crazy to think at this point, but at the same time, if we're talking about cannabis like alcohol and treating it like alcohol, it's really not that crazy. Like another good example here in Washington State, before I moved here, from Southern California, and Costco always sold alcohol as far as I can remember. And it's, I think, a pretty big business for them, and in Washington, right before I moved here, back in, I guess, 2013, they just changed the laws from the state-run liquor store. So it was still, if you wanted to buy spirits, you'd have to go to a Washington state liquor store. And Costco couldn't sell it. And so Costco lobbied hard and used their public policy arm to change it in the state. And certainly now it takes a large percentage of alcohol sales here in Washington. So, stories like that, we're like a step ahead, I guess, or there's a step in between probably before we see cannabis sold at places like Costco or places like Amazon, but you never know, and this stuff moves quickly, and as these things change, for sure the distribution, logistics, whatever it is, there's probably some opportunity for them somewhere in the years ahead. Mm-hmm. So the MORE Act, back in the MORE Act and the MORE Act getting reintroduced, I thought was pretty interesting, and I'd love anybody's insight. For me, it's great to see it back. It's great to see that it came back around. It does seem to be the best policy in a large way because of the social equity component. Was it last week we saw the Republicans introduce a little more of a business-friendly bill? Unsurprisingly, that takes away any of that social equity. But again, it's that strange bedfellows when you see both sides now introducing legislation. Coming in, I think that's a good thing, but it's really good that the MORE Act came back. The question I have for the group, and if anybody has any thoughts, is with the Senate particularly Schumer being so vocal around, this vision for what they want to see. What's the outcome of the MORE Act? Does it have a better shot? Is it just keeping the conversation going, or do we think, with someone like Amazon behind it, supporting it, that this could potentially be the framework that moves ahead? Any thoughts?
And the one thing that I will say that is concerning to me is some of the data I've seen around how the GOP, the sentiment towards certain issues like Black Lives Matter, it's actually gone quite in the opposite direction of what we would all hope, like aggressively downturn. It's the data charts on that are disturbing. So I do worry about push, frankly, on the equity piece. I do. And that's not a great feeling to have, because it's obviously an issue that matters really to all of us who've been in the space for a long time. So I don't know. I'm hopeful that the power of Amazon may override that, but I wonder if it's a big lift, because it is something that I was shocked when I saw that data last week. I can send you that link too.
Yeah, I think, the MORE Act's definitely a heavy lift. The bill that Schumer, Booker, and Wyden are working on is also going to be a heavy lift. Yeah, I'm not really confident we see legalization this year, but I think it's one of those things where you're going to get, one day people, I feel like it's just going to take, it's unclear if we have enough Democrats, right? But it's obviously, it's going to require Republicans too, at least 10 of them. And I think it's going to be one of those things where they come together and they're like, okay, I'll jump in if you jump in. One thing, this is kind of related, but just like timeline, kind of like a 30,000 foot view, what I find interesting, and John Fetterman, the lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania, and I were talking about this the other week. He said, he kind of linked cannabis legalization and same-sex marriage, the same marriage equality, in terms of timelines. Obviously, the right to marry who you want is not equivalent to being able to, smoke weed or not. But in terms of a hot button cultural issue that's debated. And then kind of how legalization has spread. Like 2 years before the Supreme Court ruled, there was same-sex marriages were legal in 17 states, and that's where we are now with cannabis. So kind of looking at that, you have a critical mass, 40% of Americans live in a state where cannabis is legal. I think it's, I don't know, a waiting game is the right term, but it's inevitable, and I think it's just gonna take people, who aren't comfortable coming out saying they support cannabis either because of their constituents or their political party or what have you, to just kind of like hold hands and jump in the pool at the same time. So, but I think both the MORE Act and whatever Schumer's gonna do, they're both heavy lifts as of right now. And, analysts, Vivian Azar isn't convinced it's going to happen until 2022. That's kind of the conservative viewpoint is like, it's not going to happen this year. But, with surprises like Amazon, it's crazy. So.
Yeah. You just reminded me, Sparc, who we'll be talking about in a little bit, they had this t-shirt that said legalize gay pot. That used to be like the thing, and then after the election in California, it was legalized gay pot, and it was just how those issues track, and it's like still to this day one of my favorite T-shirts that I own. I own both of them. Yeah. So anyway, the issues were very connected for sure.
Yeah, and LGBT rights and marijuana legalization, at least like medical marijuana, were born really together in Berkeley, which is fascinating. That could be its own podcast episode. But.
Totally.
It's true.
And Pride Month, the best time to kind of celebrate and honor that overlapping history. Mm-hmm. I think also when you zoom out on the policy side, it's only been just over a year that we've had federal legislation even on the table. And so, looking at the big picture, it's all progress, including Amazon making progressive policies, and so it makes me feel hopeful.
Yeah, that is a good point. It seems like it's going slow, but to put it in that perspective, federal legalization and even 2014, maybe even 2016 was not even something that you could really dream of. Like that kind of the ultimate goal was like, well, so long, Obama stopped doing raids in 2012, so long as that stops, the industry is happy. But yeah, that's a good point, Maggie.
Agree.
Yeah, maybe it's like the joke about bankruptcy, right? It happens really, really slowly, then all of a sudden.
Right.
We'll see the same thing with cannabis. Feels like it's taken a long time, and then it could just be pretty quick. Whether that's 2021, 2022, but hopefully sooner than later, given all this momentum here. Well,
unless you're a cannabis company and you don't have bankruptcy protection.
Yeah.
And then it never happens.
Fair.
Anyway.
Fair. So speaking of cannabis companies, just to touch on some earnings news, I know we talk a lot about, the MSOs and the Canadian LPs, and I know Canopy Growth recently reported their fiscal year fourth quarter earnings. Some numbers came in. Their net revenue was just under 150 million Canadian. When I think you compare that to some of the U.S. MSOs that we've talked about, they're in the range of 150 to I think almost 200 million in quarterly revenue here in the U.S. The big difference, though, I would say with Canopy and what came out is that they're still losing money. It's almost $100 million EBITDA loss, and when you look at the U.S. companies, they're talking about positive margins there. The story apparently is that they're going to get to their profitability target. It's probably going to be a little over 6 months from now, but that's what they're marching towards. But I think it does show, and some like Andrew Carter at Stifel highlighted that it really illustrates that it's quite expensive to compete in the Canadian market, and you're seeing more and more consolidation happening there. Canopy Growth recently bought Supreme. I think a lot of the revenue at Canopy Growth was driven by some of the less expensive flower, and Supreme I know is kind of positioned as a more premium brand, and so maybe they're looking to things like premiumization to drive more sales. We'll see. But one thing I wanted to talk about with the group here is that their CEO David Klein on a call with analysts mentioned that he's very bullish on U.S. legalization, which ties into kind of our conversation that we just had, and he thinks that it will happen faster than most. He said, quote, "I personally believe federal legalization will move faster than maybe a lot of people think." And they're really looking at the U.S. and the U.S. opportunity. And I know that Canopy Growth has some CBD brands, partnerships with individuals like Martha Stewart. They're doing a direct-to-consumer play with a lot of their CBD products. They recently announced a distribution deal with Southern Glazers for their Quattro CBD beverage. So, they're dabbling in the U.S. in the CBD market, like we've discussed quite a bit on this podcast. But, when they talk about the U.S., what do you think, like a company like Canopy, their experience in Canada, does it give them any advantages here, in the U.S. specifically? They have that crazy acreage deal, which I think just gets worse by the minute as acreage moves out of Florida and all of that. But I mean, what is it, if anything, do they have should legalize here that the U.S. companies won't already have?
I mean,
Guys,
you just hit on
quick.
so many things. Yeah, you gotta go.
I'm sorry, but I need to run actually. So
All good, Will.
but I
You
just
go
wanted
ahead,
to say
Will.
thank you.
It was great to
Thanks for
have you.
coming.
Yeah,
Yeah, of course. Thanks for inviting me. All right, guys.
for sure. We'll see you.
Bye.
To me, this is a lot of the stuff that really bothers me about the way this legalization has rolled out. You've probably heard me talk about it before, but I do feel like what we're seeing here is because I understand from my political consultants that David Klein has had a audience with our U.S. lawmakers, and to me, that really, really bothers me as an industry that's trying to build a U.S. industry, to know that he has that audience. And the reason I believe that is true is because of Constellation and their mighty lobbying power. And ever since that transaction got done, and I'll never forget it, because Tahira and I were speaking in Canada, and Bruce Linton got to announce that that transaction was happening while we were supposed to be speaking. So you can imagine we had 3 people in our room for our presentation. But it's hard for me to not see that Constellation is behind this, and this has been their way to load up a balance sheet and then backflip into the U.S. cannabis industry. And maybe they do it first through these beverages that you were just talking about. But it's, to me, a pretty transparent move. And the acreage assets that they grabbed are, I would consider, pretty low quality, but they may make that work as a way to enter in. And then they do have a relationship with TerraSend as well. So there are some ways that they're looking at this, but I think it will take them a lot longer. And at this point, the people they will be competing against in the United States are pretty formidable. I think that even going back to the Amazon point, you'll notice the MSOs were not upset about Amazon getting into this industry. I think they see it as a bolster to our progress. And what's more is they've all been training for this moment. You know, they've been preparing for this. We've all been preparing for this. So I think that, you know, bring it on. But I'm not a bull on how this impacts Canopy's business, because it's still not a good business. They still can't make money selling cannabis. So I just think even if the US market opens up, they're still going to struggle, because beverage still has a long way to go. It is early days in beverage. And so it's, to me, there's still a huge dip to this J curve to seeing how they come out of this. So I'm not a bull on it. And I think Andrew Carter from Stifel has been one of the best analysts who've been tracking this. So if people are interested in digging in, I really respect the way he's been looking at this for a long time. So just to give him a shout out.
Yeah, no, all good points. And I guess speaking of M&A in Canada, you know, HEXO made some news this week with their acquisition of Retican, and I feel like Retican, even like day one in Canada, we saw a lot of their numbers coming through and some of the data we track at Headset, and they were a notable brand that I feel like, and this is just anecdotally, like I didn't seem to be getting as much attention out there. It was like really a very well-performing brand, but wasn't one of the big names that everyone talked about, like a Canopy Growth. So it's interesting to see that, you know, HEXO made this. I guess it was a $925 million purchase price. They released this epic promotional video that I'll try and link to in the show notes, because it's pretty great, about what they're combining into, which is essentially the largest cannabis company in Canada. I think they're taking the crown from Tilray at the moment. But we'll see. And then just to kind of give you a sense of like the sales data for Retican, I looked at 2020 full year and 2021 through May in Alberta, British Columbia, Ontario, and Saskatchewan, and they did over $200 million in sales, ranked number 8 in the market. And pretty good margins. In that video, they talk about their margins. They talk about their production and their automation as a big reason why HEXO liked them, because they were really efficient. Margins are fair, you know, 30 to 35%, depending on the category. So could just be a byproduct of, you know, price pressure in Canada, everything there. But just interesting to see, you know, I think it seems like the musical chair game is kind of coming to an end, or it's just going to get a little longer tail with some of these operators, because the larger ones have kind of come together now. But there's still a number of smaller ones, and given the way that Canada's panning out, I expect to see a bit more of this. But kind of leads me into you know, the U.S. and you know, wanted to touch on some U.S. M&A, and you know, Maggie, you know, with your brand Besito and Sparc, I think there's some acquisition news there. So anything you want to or can talk about and touch on, and kind of that experience?
Yeah, we just announced this morning that Sparc has acquired Besito, and I will be going with the company and the brand to be the VP of Brand and Marketing over at Sparc. Thrilled about it. They have such an incredible management team, which was, of course, a big consideration for me, especially because I wanted to stay involved. And just so respect not only what they've done, but how they've done it over 2 decades almost. They have really been around in NorCal and serving their communities, reinvesting in their communities. Eric's been leading compassionate care programs for decades. So I'm really thrilled about it. The synergies make perfect sense. They have this incredible biodynamic farm in Sonoma Valley. they manufacture, and of course they have some incredible Sparc dispensaries. So for a brand like mine, and I made the decision 5 years ago not to get a manufacturing license, wanted to stay asset light, did not feel like I needed to own that piece of the supply chain, coming from Pepsi and Starbucks and co-packing not being a dirty word, the way that white label has become in cannabis. Obviously, the way the regulations and the market shook out since, I changed my mind on that and felt like we needed to be vertically integrated for consistent biomass and quality control of our product. And then owning our channel, which is super exciting and a unique position for Besito to now have to be part of the Sparc stores. And so I'll be running Besito, but also there are other awesome brands, Marigold and Farm Direct, and really excited just to, I think about it as CPG, that's my background. And so have a portfolio where we can strategically create brands and products for every segment and corner of the industry. And really, I'm excited about innovation. We've had so many ideas about products we dream of, but very hard to bring them to life with kind of an arm's length transaction. And so there's incredible R&D talent in Sparc, and so just feel like we're poised for a next chapter where we can continue to create great brands and products, but as part of a larger, really smart team with a lot more resources and infrastructure. So I'm seeing that every day now, the M&A, I think that these first few years, we've all figured out what we're great at. And now is the time for synergies across the board and kind of getting with your bigger team as we head towards federal legalization, maybe.
Yeah, certainly. And with Besito, you guys are bringing in vapor pens and is it pre-rolls, I believe?
Correct. We have a custom vaporizer. I never thought you'd ask. Here it is. It's hexagonal. It doesn't roll off the table. Super beautiful. And then, we have a little tin of mini joints. Besito means little kiss. And so the idea has always been around intuitive dosing and making an accessible brand that won't kind of send you into outer space if that's not what you signed up for. And of course, with the goal of just bringing more folks into plant medicine and cannabis who otherwise maybe had a bad, brownie experience in college. So lightly dosed.
Yeah, that's great. And then with Marigold and Farm Direct and now Besito underneath Sparc, in those brands, mostly flour, right? Flour and pre-roll. Is there like edibles? No beverages quite yet,
Marigold, right? Marigold has just launched a gummy.
Okay.
So, yes, is the answer.
Yeah,
I think flour forward, of course, with that amazing farm, that's a no-brainer. But especially using the data that we have at the store level and doing consumer research, we definitely want to cover all the categories. And I came from beverage, Pepsi and Starbucks, and so when I started Besito, actually, I had a beverage hypothesis. Of course, there was no infrastructure for it, so I pivoted away from that, but absolutely still, of course, believe in the opportunity, and it's where my skill set lies, and so would not be surprised to see beverage come up as well.
And is the strategy, like so many companies these days, kind of be a CPG brand and a retail arm, and then still continuing to sell products like Besito through other retailers, or is it going strictly to Sparc and that would be the only place you could get it going forward?
Exactly. It's both. Obviously, to your first point, utilizing the power of the vertical nature makes perfect sense, and it's an incredible way that we can build consumer and brand loyalty. You are where you sell, right? And I've had no control over that as Besito, but now with Sparc, we are where we sell, and we can control that touch point end to end for the consumer and really create that loyalty over time. At the same time, especially given just the nature of this wholesale, highly regulated business, we want all California consumers to have access to the great products we're going to make. And so making sure we're available at other top retailers to make it as easy as possible for our consumers to get our products where they are remains a priority.
Yeah, and you mentioned all the great data you can get from the store level, and having that relationship with the customer probably means you can learn a lot directly versus having an intermediary for so much of Besito's existence now with the stores connected. There's some serious advantages.
I don't have to tell you, a black hole for me, and so it's incredible to dig in and really know our person and really build products, with and for them.
Yeah, that's very cool, and it does seem to be a lot of the model we see with some of the MSOs and in large organizations they all kind of have different strategies, where they're some more focused on retail, less on brands, some a little bit of a mix, some more focused on like wholesale, but have a little bit of retail. There is that overlap, but it is a unique kind of structure, I think, in cannabis versus some other, I guess, traditional CPG, right? It's rare to see that. And, there's direct to consumer, like if you guys were selling your brands direct to consumer, and then you have, maybe a retail store, but you wouldn't be selling other brands necessarily. You're just focused on your brand and your brick and mortar kind of play, like a Warby Parker, right? You can't buy their glasses there.
Exactly. And I came in and I remember, again, 2017 and really a bit later, but everyone's starting rec here in California, and everyone wanted to do everything. And I was kind of like, this is unique to cannabis. When I use the analog of CPG, you don't really seed to sale. But now I see, of course, and again, how the market has ended up, why that's critical. And it is part of the fun, just as a marketer and designer, to really think about those touch points beyond product, but in retail and even at the farm. It's so beautiful, and we're gonna do some cool things up there and kind of open it up, and so it's only, talk about omnichannel. It's every single touch point, and that also, I think, goes back to our role in educating and destigmatizing. We can literally bring you to our farm to see where it's grown, smoke a Besito joint together, and that's how folks are going to understand and have real transparency into this industry and the full supply chain.
Yeah. Don't need any excuse to get to that farm. I've been to that farm once, and it's an amazing place to be. So I would love to do that again sometime. Go ahead, Emily.
I'll be back. No, I'm glad you mentioned the omnichannel, because I know you wrote about that, and it's something that I think the other thing is that people have just been, just saying it's going to be about brands, but I don't think, Maggie, you have a very unique background coming from CPG before this. And I think that one of the things that's been missing a little bit is that connection, or that kind of like, it's the engagement around it that really helps to hook people in. And I think that's where we're heading with brand building. And we've seen it with some of the MSOs are getting better and better at it, rather than just saying like, we're going to launch whatever this is because it's a category that's moving. But I think that connecting the dots on that, and especially in California where it's so competitive to be a brand in this market, and this is the market that I feel like is the great proving ground for other markets in the US to look at, to see how competitive it can get with all these different brands and form factors on the shelves. So I'm pretty excited to see what I'm considering more elevated brand building and coming together. There was a previous wave of M&A that I feel is a little different than this wave of M&A. Previous wave of M&A was kind of like, let's get together. Now it feels like, hey, we think we've got a lot that we can do together. We fill in some gaps for each other, and let's do this and go. And I feel a couple of the consolidation moves I saw this week were further validation of that. So I think it's a much more strategic round of consolidation than the previous one, which was kind of like hit the panic button and party down. I don't know.
Right. And there's some unique ones that happened recently. Like I'm thinking of the Glass House and parent company, which if you had asked me a couple weeks ago, I would have said, well, they're, diehard competitors, right? They're going to battle it out, relatively well capitalized, building these brands and both have retail footprints and so on. But they just did a deal where their parent company invested in Glasshouse and is getting some production from them. And I was talking to Graham Farrar over at Glasshouse, the president, and I kind of was talking about the unique aspect of cannabis and different than traditional CPG. And he had a great analogy, I thought. He mentioned reminds him of Apple and Samsung. For those familiar with the tech world, a lot of the parts in an iPhone are made by Samsung, like the flash memory and so on, right? So they're very dependent on Samsung for parts for the iPhone. Without Samsung, I think you wouldn't. Apple would struggle, right? They'd have to make a lot of these parts themselves. But at the same time, Samsung is their biggest competitor with phones, right? With their Galaxy phones or Android phones out there. So on the one hand, they're competing, with consumers, but on the other hand, they're a supplier for them. So I thought that was kind of a unique analogy in kind of relationships like that. But it does feel much more strategic, less panicked, like you're saying, Emily, and very kind of mindful. And I think we'll see more and more of this. And I think the Besito, joining Sparc and the new brands that you'll be able to build there, I think it'll be another great story to watch, as this stuff continues to unfold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just staying on the brand building train for a second. I think it's just the beginning of sort of smart brands, right? Looking back the last few years in California, a brand is a promise, and it was very hard for anyone to keep a promise with disruptive supply chains and everyone figuring out who they are and where they are, and brands coming and going off shelves. And so what's interesting to me right now is we do have more consolidated market share per category, but I would not call it brand loyalty because it's often price driven. And when I ask folks what pre-rolls, what gummy they're buying, they can't name the brand. And they're buying one of those, cheap ones that have lead market share right now. But yes, it's not sort of lasting brand loyalty, which is, the role of smart, meaningful brands over time.
Yeah, certainly early innings, and that's why this stuff's so fascinating, these stories, and just kind of, we'll look back, 10 years from now, and it'll be amazing to see, there hopefully will be some solid brand loyalty by that point in a fully federally legal landscape. So really great to have you, Maggie. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks for sharing that stuff, and it's exciting news, and congrats on the acquisition, and congrats on all the success there with Besito. I think that'll do it for today. Catch us next week, as I'm sure we'll cover more and more news. Who knows, maybe everything will be legal by then at the rate of things moving here. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see everyone next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset. For more information on Headset, visit headset.io.